So I want to get back to the Gaza aid fiasco. Today, thousands of Gaza residents stormed this dystopian Israeli American aid complex in Western Rafah. The temperature is boiling. They're being forced to stand in long lines under hot sun in a fence camp. There's biometric surveillance in order to get them in. This is all the product of Israeli plan to subvert UNRWA and the United Nations aid distribution complex, which has effectively supplied the people of Gaza with everything they've needed, including first-class free schooling since 1950. And this is what it looks like under the watch of this so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which we'll explain to you. And it's chaos. People are now fleeing live fire after a stampede predictably ensued. That's a concentration camp, everybody. And this is a Holocaust. And this concentration camp is being guarded by American or maintained by American mercenaries on behalf of an apartheid state called Israel. Here's what they get. You can see, I'll go back really quickly. You can see right here at the bottom of your screen, you can see GHF. That's the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which is overseeing all this, but no one really knows what the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is. And it is connected to two firms, one called Safe Reach Solutions, and another that I think is called UC Global, which are hiring American mercenaries for this task. And here's a look at one of the mercenaries on the scene who was hired by one of these firms operating under the GHF auspices. And he's kind of just like mocking thousands and thousands of desperate war refugees inside a concentration camp today in Western Rafah. And they've been lured there with the promise of food, and they will be kept there to prevent them from returning home. So Israel can occupy the Gaza Strip, presumably steal their land.
For people just listening, he's giving the heart sign to the crowd and also the aloha hand gesture. So yeah, he's mocking them, or maybe he thinks he's some noble humanitarian as thousands of starving people wait for like a pittance of food from his scam organization, which ultimately traces back to Israel. It's basically an Israeli front group at the behest of, with the involvement of the U.S. government to, as you said, replace the existing humanitarian mechanism that is already in Gaza, UNRWA.
Yeah, so let's kind of get into what this organization is. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation was spun out of the Maritime Foundation that maintained or conceived the Gaza Aid Pier back in 2024. Remember the Gaza Aid Pier that the U.S. government paid $325 million for, U.S. taxpayer money. A pier was placed by U.S. naval engineers or U.S. Army engineers off the Gaza shore, and it floated away into the sea. Almost nothing came into the Gaza Strip through that pier. The pier was ultimately used for the blood-soaked operation the Israeli army enacted to rescue Noam Argamani, the Nova Electronic Music Festival captive and 3 others, during which they slaughtered over 250 people at a market, an open air market in, I believe, Deir al-Balah, after their special forces team, which was operating undercover, posing as a Gaza aid convoy, one of the few convoys that came in through the pier, was exposed. And so the Gaza aid pier was then used to spirit out the so-called hostages, one of whom appeared with Netanyahu in Congress. And 250 people were murdered, bombed, slaughtered, shot at point blank range. That was the aid pier. And then all these organizations that were behind that were spun out into something else called the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation through an Israeli initiative, which was exposed in the Washington Post. But it had been reported on by other outlets. We'd even done some reporting at the Grayzone, republishing reporter Jack Paulson, on how Safe Reach Solutions was actually operating out of a generational wealth management office by people with no experience in humanitarian aid. The Washington Post is one of many publications that corroborated that reporting and showed that the Israelis were actually behind this. It starts out with, last year, a group of former U.S. intelligence and defense officials and business executives working in close consultation with Israel prepared a proposal for supplying aid to Gaza that would address Israeli government claims that assistance was being diverted by Hamas. The UN, if you talk to them, will state clearly Hamas was not diverting any aid. The problem was that Hamas was protecting the aid, and they didn't want the aid reaching the population because they want to control aid as a means of preventing Hamas from reconstituting and to starve the population into submission to Israeli objectives, basically to get their captives out without having to give Hamas anything, like a relaxation of the siege or more prisoners out. The group detailed a radically new and ambitious model, the creation of an organization called the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation that would hire armed private contractors to provide logistics and security for a handful of aid distribution hubs to be built in southern Gaza. So all the horrors you saw today, these are the blueprints. Palestinians would have to travel to the hubs and submit to identity checks to receive rations from NGOs. They would live, eventually, the Palestinians, in guarded compounds, concentration camps, in other words, that would each house up to tens of thousands of non-combatants. But the planners started to anticipate potentially damaging questions from the public about the opaque origin of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, lack of qualifications of its leadership, and moral legitimacy, because all it's doing is providing humanitarian cover to a Holocaust. And the Washington Post reports it's scheduled to launch Monday. They're not sure how it's going to succeed. And then they go over some internal documents, as well as interviews with GHF executives and advisors and Israeli officials, people familiar with the foundation, who outline significant hurdles that they're planning to face, and provided a 198-page confidential document showing that the GHF has no past projects or performance to fall on. They need international aid groups with credibility, but don't have any. The UN is not cooperating. There's confusion, doubt about who will even lead the organization, public skepticism. And then here's the best part, most revealing part. The GHF is likely to encounter allegations likening its food distribution hubs and residential compounds with, quote, concentration camps with biometrics, or comparing the organization with Blackwater, former U.S. mercenary firm implicated in violence against civilians in Iraq, whose founder, Eric Prince, by the way, is very close to the Trump administration, as well as to Mohammed bin Zayed, the Emirati crown prince, who is also close to the Trump administration. Prince lives in the UAE, and the UAE was supposed to put up money for the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, but it's not clear where the money's coming from. Even the Israeli army has questioned this plan and said that long queues at GHF hubs would lead to stampedes. Well, that's what we saw today, but they still went ahead with it. And then it says that GHF has secured $100 million from an undisclosed donor. Who is it? Why don't we know who that donor is? So the whole thing is shady. And then after that article drops, the whole thing collapsed. It just collapsed overnight. This is another Washington Post article. Late Sunday, Jake Wood, the head of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, resigned, saying the group's plans could not be consistent with what he called the humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. And the chief operating officer, David Burke, also resigned. And the Swiss, I mean, this isn't reported here, but Ynet, the Israeli broadsheet, reported today that the Swiss government is now investigating GHF, criminal investigation. It is no longer active, what was registered in Switzerland, and now it's operating as the GHF, but through some kind of US entity. And keep in mind, all of this has been approved by the Trump administration, Christian Zionist fanatic US Israeli reciprocal ambassador Mike Huckabee personally approved this in March. And the impetus came from Israel. And I think, Aaron, that everyone's resigning because they can see the writing on the wall. I mean, these are rats fleeing a sinking ship for sure, but they don't want to take responsibility for the disaster that was about to ensue. And they don't want to be complicit in a gigantic war crime, but they took it this far. I mean, up until last week, Jake Wood was doing interviews with all the cable news networks about what's happening.
Well, exactly. What does it tell you that someone like Jake Wood, who's a Marine veteran, war profiteer, whose own planning documents, as you quoted, talked about concerns from the public that this would be a concentration camp with biometrics. They were willing to take part in this up until it was about to launch, and they felt compelled to resign. It tells you that they just, like, the scale of evil and criminality here is just so extreme that even someone who's willing to profit off of that realized that it would be against their own self-interest to take part in it, so they couldn't go ahead with it. I mean, that's unprecedented to me. I've never seen a high-level resignation of a foundation like that. Well, first of all, I've never heard of a dystopian scheme like this before. It's sort of head spinning. But even before it launches, they can't go ahead with it because they realize it's just the criminality and the evil is just too much to conceal. And just to stress what you said earlier, it's in the South for a reason. These so-called aid centers are in the South because they want to push everybody in Gaza to there, so they can also ultimately facilitate ethnic cleansing. First, you imprison them. First, you kidnap people, as reportedly has happened, actually, with people showing up have reportedly been detained in some cases. And many people are now sleeping there because they're hoping, desperate, that, because they have no other choice for aid. The people are sleeping there overnight in the hopes that tomorrow they'll get something when it opens up again. Completely dystopian. Even some of the profiteers, the top profiteers involved, couldn't even go ahead with